There is a particular cruelty in public humiliation that those who have never experienced it cannot truly comprehend, for it is not merely the moment itself that wounds, but the endless echo of it, the way a single instant of mortification can shatter the carefully constructed edifice of a life and leave one forever changed, forever cautious, forever aware that the world has seen you at your most vulnerable and found you wanting. Lady Eleanor Ashworth understood this truth with an intimacy she would not have wished upon her worst enemy, though at 23 she possessed too gentle a spirit to claim any enemies at all. She was the only daughter of Viscount Ashworth, a man of ancient lineage and modest means, and she had been raised in that peculiar stratum of English society where one possessed all the expectations of nobility with few of the resources to meet them. Eleanor was not a beauty in the way that poets wrote sonnets, not possessed of golden curls or striking features that commanded attention upon entering a room, but there was something in her warm brown eyes that spoke of intelligence and kindness, something in the quiet dignity of her bearing that drew those who took the time to truly see her. She had a gentle loveliness, the sort that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over still water, and those who knew her well considered her the finest woman of their acquaintance. But London in the spring of 1815 cared little for gentle loveliness or quiet dignity, for this was the height of the season, when society gathered like glittering peacocks to display their plumage and secure advantageous matches, and Eleanor had retreated from all of it. She had not attended a ball in 2 years, had not worn her dancing slippers or felt the press of a crowded ballroom or endured the measuring gazes of marriageable gentlemen. Instead, she remained in the country whenever possible, helping her aging father manage their declining estate, reviewing accounts that grew ever more troubling, and pretending that she did not notice her mother's worried glances or the way her father's hands trembled more with each passing month. She had made herself useful, indispensable even, because usefulness was something she could offer when she had nothing else, when hope had proven itself a luxury she could ill afford. The wound she carried was not visible to the casual observer, but it lived within her nonetheless, a constant companion that whispered in quiet moments that she had been weighed and measured by the world and found insufficient. She did not speak of it, this thing that had happened to her, this moment that had cleaved her life into before and after, but it informed every choice she made, every careful step she took away from the glittering world that had once seemed so full of promise. Eleanor Ashworth had learned, in the cruelest possible fashion, that dreams were dangerous things, and she had resolved never to dream again. The memory, when it came, arrived unbidden, as memories of such magnitude always do, surfacing in quiet moments when Eleanor's defenses were lowered and her mind wandered to places she had forbidden it to go. 2 years prior, she had been a different creature entirely, a young woman of 21 who still believed that goodness might be rewarded and that a gentleman's words could be trusted. Lord Reginald Blackmore had seemed everything a young lady might hope for, heir to the Earl of Westmore, possessed of golden hair and easy charm, and a smile that made Eleanor's heart flutter in ways she had read about in novels but never experienced. He had sought her out at assemblies, had danced with her twice when propriety demanded he dance with her only once, had walked with her in gardens and spoken of futures and possibilities in that careless way handsome young men speak when they believe they hold all the power in the world. Eleanor had been cautious, for caution was her nature, but even caution could not withstand the persistent siege of hope, and she had allowed herself, in the quietest chambers of her heart, to believe that perhaps she might be loved after all. Their courtship had lasted through the autumn and into the winter, long enough for society to whisper of an expected announcement, long enough for Eleanor's mother to speak of wedding clothes and Eleanor's father to inquire delicately about settlements, long enough for Eleanor herself to imagine a life as Lady Blackmore and to feel that perhaps her modest dowry and lack of connections might not matter to a man who claimed to value her gentle spirit above all worldly considerations. She had been a fool, though she had not known it then, and her foolishness had been revealed to all the world on the glittering night of Lady Pembroke's spring ball, when the finest families of London had gathered in their silks and jewels to see and be seen. Eleanor had arrived with hope singing in her veins, wearing her best gown of pale pink muslin, expecting that this might be the very night Reginald would speak to her father and make his intentions known. Instead, she had watched from across the ballroom as he raised his glass and announced his engagement to Miss Arabella Thornton, a horse-faced heiress with £40,000 and a father who had made his fortune in trade, and the world had tilted beneath Eleanor's feet and never quite righted itself again. She might have survived even that, might have retreated quietly and nursed her wounds in private, had she not heard his voice carrying across the room when a mutual acquaintance expressed surprise at the match and mentioned Eleanor's name. "Miss Ashworth," he had said with a laugh that cut like shattered glass, "surely you jest. She has nothing to recommend her but a pleasing face. A man of my position requires fortune, not sentiment," and the laughter of those around him had risen like a wave to drown her, and Eleanor had stood frozen as the whispers spread and the glances turned her way, pitying and amused and cruel all at once. And she had learned in that single devastating moment that she had been nothing but a diversion, a pleasant way to pass the time until a better prospect emerged, and she had vowed as she retreated from that ballroom with her head held high and her heart in ruins that she would never allow herself to be so deceived again. 2 years had passed since that dreadful evening, and Eleanor had transformed herself into something practical and useful, a daughter who would not burden her family with foolish hopes or romantic notions that served no purpose but to invite further pain. She had refused her mother's gentle suggestions that she might try another season, had dismissed the notion that time might heal wounds or that society might forget, for she knew better now, knew that the world remembered weakness and fed upon it, and she would not offer herself up for consumption a second time. Instead, she had made herself indispensable at Ashworth Manor, their modest country estate, where the paint peeled quietly from the window frames and the roof leaked in the eastern wing, and the servants who remained did so more from loyalty than from any certainty of continued wages. Her father's health had begun to fail in earnest, his once robust constitution weakening under the twin burdens of age and worry, and Eleanor had taken over the management of the household accounts with a competence that surprised even herself, discovering in the columns of figures and the careful allocation of dwindling resources a kind of peace that came from knowing exactly where one stood, even if where one stood was upon increasingly unstable ground. She knew to the penny what they owed and to whom, knew which creditors might be persuaded to patience and which would not, knew that the silver would need to be sold before winter, and that even then they would struggle to maintain the fiction of gentility that was all they had left. Her mother watched her with eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and grief, grateful for a daughter who had risen to meet their circumstances with such quiet strength, grieving for the laughing girl who had once dreamed of love and ballrooms and a future bright with possibility. Eleanor understood her mother's sorrow but could not share it, for she had made her peace with reality and found it far less painful than fantasy, had learned that love was a luxury afforded to those with fortune enough to cushion its inevitable disappointments, and she possessed no such cushion. She would be sensible, would be practical, would ensure that her parents lived out their remaining years in whatever comfort she could provide, and she would expect nothing for herself beyond the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. This was the life she had chosen, or rather the life that had been chosen for her by circumstances beyond her control, and she had accepted it with the same quiet dignity that had always defined her, that gentle strength that others so rarely noticed until it was too late. She did not know, on the grey March morning when the letter arrived bearing a seal she did not recognize, that everything she had resigned herself to accept was about to change, that fate had not yet finished writing her story, and that the next chapter would begin with words she could never have anticipated from a man she had never met. The letter bore a seal Eleanor did not recognize, heavy crimson wax impressed with a crest that spoke of ancient lineage and considerable consequence, and her fingers trembled slightly as she broke it open in the dim light of her father's study, where she had been reviewing the quarterly accounts and calculating how many more months they might manage before the pretense of solvency collapsed entirely. The words within made no sense upon first reading, nor upon second, and it was only upon the third that Eleanor allowed herself to believe what was written there, an invitation to present herself at the London residence of His Grace Marcus Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, at her earliest convenience to discuss a matter of mutual interest. The Duke of Ashworth, a man whose name Eleanor knew only from the whispered conversations of others, for he moved in circles so far above her own diminished sphere that she might as well have been reading of a character from mythology rather than a living gentleman who apparently wished to speak with her. She knew what society said of him, had heard the rumours even in her rural isolation, for the Duke of Ashworth was the sort of man about whom everyone spoke and no one truly knew. He was 32 years of age, possessed of a fortune so vast that even the most ambitious mothers of the ton could scarcely calculate its extent, master of estates that sprawled across 3 counties, and a London house that was said to rival Carlton House itself in its magnificence. He was also, by all accounts, utterly impossible, a man of stern countenance and cold demeanour who never danced at balls, rarely smiled at anyone, and had been known to reduce grown men to stammering with nothing more than a single glacial glance from his piercing grey eyes. The whispers painted him as formidable, as intimidating, as a man who had never in his life needed to charm anyone because the world bent itself to his will without requiring any effort on his part. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had reportedly been pressing him for years to select a bride and secure the succession, but he had dismissed every candidate presented to him, every diamond of the first water and every accomplished heiress, with the same dismissive indifference that characterized all his interactions with society. Why such a man would summon Eleanor Ashworth, daughter of a viscount of modest means and even more modest reputation, was a mystery that defied all logic, and yet the letter was unmistakably real, the seal genuine, the invitation clear. Her parents received the news with expressions that might have been comical under different circumstances, her mother's teacup frozen halfway to her lips, and her father's newspaper lowered to reveal eyes wide with bewildered astonishment. They questioned her, questioned themselves, questioned whether perhaps the letter had been misdirected or was some elaborate jest. But the quality of the paper and the authority of the seal could not be denied, and at last Eleanor rose from her chair and announced that she would go, not because she expected anything to come of it, not because she harbored any delusions about what a duke might want with a woman like her, but because her family could not afford to give offense to such a powerful man, and because curiosity, that dangerous companion she had thought long since abandoned, had stirred within her chest and demanded satisfaction. Ashworth House rose before Eleanor like a monument to everything she was not, its pale stone facade stretching impossibly wide across the most fashionable square in Mayfair, its windows gleaming with the kind of pristine clarity that spoke of an army of servants, whose sole purpose was to ensure that not a single speck of dust dared settle upon any surface, and she felt her courage falter as the carriage door opened and a footman in immaculate livery handed her down onto the pavement with the kind of practiced deference she had never in her life experienced. The entrance hall alone could have swallowed her family's entire ground floor, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the light of a chandelier that dripped with crystals worth more than her father's annual income, and Eleanor forced herself to breathe steadily as a butler of imposing dignity led her through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to gaze down upon her with aristocratic disapproval, as though they knew she did not belong among such magnificence and were merely waiting for her to realize it herself and flee. She was shown into a drawing room of elegant proportions, left alone, with her thundering heart and her best dress that had seemed respectable enough in her own modest home, but now felt painfully inadequate against the silk-covered walls and furniture that gleamed with the patina of generations of careful tending, and she was still cataloguing all the ways in which she fell short of her surroundings when the door opened and he entered, and every thought in her head scattered like startled birds. The Duke of Ashworth was tall, taller than she had expected, with dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as his ancestral home, all sharp angles and severe lines that might have been handsome if they had ever softened into anything resembling warmth. His eyes were grey, the grey of winter storms and cold steel, and they assessed her with an intensity that made Eleanor feel as though he could see straight through her careful composure to the frightened woman beneath, who was wondering what madness had possessed her to come here at all. He did not smile as he greeted her, did not offer any of the social pleasantries that might have eased the tension crackling in the air between them, merely gestured for her to sit and took his own seat across from her, with the economy of movement that characterized a man who had never in his life needed to waste effort on anything so trivial as putting others at ease. Their conversation began with stilted formality, questions about her journey and her family's health that he asked with the air of a man performing an obligation rather than expressing genuine interest. And yet Eleanor found herself noting the directness of his gaze, the way he actually listened to her responses rather than simply waiting for her to finish speaking so he might continue with his own agenda. When at last he explained why he had summoned her, his words were so unexpected that Eleanor could only stare at him in bewildered silence, for he spoke of having observed her, of admiring qualities she had never imagined anyone might notice: her kindness to servants, her dignity in the face of social slight, her complete lack of the simpering pretension that characterized so many ladies of the ton. He made clear, with that same unflinching directness, that this was a practical matter, not a romantic one, and Eleanor understood then that whatever this strange man wanted from her, it was not her heart, which was perhaps the only reassurance that allowed her to remain in her seat and hear what he would say next. The silence that followed his declaration stretched between them like a living thing, and Eleanor found herself searching his face for some sign of jest or cruelty, some indication that this was an elaborate humiliation designed to wound her further. But those grey eyes held nothing but steady certainty, the unwavering gaze of a man who had never in his life made an offer he did not intend to honor. He spoke of marriage as one might speak of a business arrangement, which she supposed it was, outlining the terms with the same precision he might have used to negotiate the purchase of an estate or the merger of two financial interests. And yet the substance of what he offered was so far beyond anything Eleanor had dared imagine that she could scarcely comprehend the words as he spoke them. He required a duchess, he explained, a woman of sense and dignity who could manage his household and stand beside him in society without embarrassing him with simpering affectations or transparent attempts to manipulate him for her own advancement, and he had observed enough of Eleanor's character to believe she possessed the qualities he sought. In exchange, he would clear her family's debts in their entirety, settle a sum upon her parents that would ensure their comfort for the remainder of their lives, and provide Eleanor herself with an allowance generous enough to guarantee her independence, regardless of how their arrangement progressed. He did not speak of affection, did not pretend to emotions he clearly did not feel, and Eleanor found herself oddly grateful for his honesty, even as some small, foolish part of her heart mourned the absence of softer words. This was not love, would never be love, but it was security and purpose, and the salvation of everyone she held dear, and was that not more valuable than the romantic fantasies she had once been naive enough to cherish? She asked for time to consider, her voice steadier than she had expected, and something flickered in his expression that might have been approval or might have been surprise that she had not immediately accepted what any other woman in her position would have seized without hesitation. He granted her request with a brief nod, naming a period of 1 week during which she might reflect and consult with her family. And Eleanor rose to take her leave, feeling as though she were moving through a dream from which she might wake at any moment. She was halfway to the door when she realized she was shivering, the cold of the room having seeped through her inadequate pelisse without her notice, and before she could speak or even fully register her own discomfort, the Duke had rung for a servant and ordered tea to be brought, his voice carrying that same tone of command that seemed as natural to him as breathing. It was such a small thing, such a trivial gesture, and yet Eleanor found herself turning to look at him with new eyes, wondering what manner of man noticed that a woman he barely knew was cold and moved to remedy her discomfort before she had even thought to mention it herself. And she carried that wondering with her all the long carriage ride home, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit the picture she had been given of the cold and formidable Duke of Ashworth. The conversation with her parents unfolded exactly as Eleanor had anticipated, her mother's eyes filling with tears that spilled down her weathered cheeks as the full implications of the Duke's offer became clear, her father sitting in heavy silence, with his hands clasped before him and his expression cycling through relief and gratitude, and something that looked painfully like guilt, as though he blamed himself for the circumstances that had brought his daughter to the point of accepting a loveless marriage to save them all from ruin. Her mother spoke of providence and blessings, of prayers answered and futures secured, and Eleanor listened with a smile fixed carefully upon her face, while inside she catalogued all the things she was surrendering, the girlish dreams she had once harbored of a husband who would look at her with adoration, of a marriage built upon mutual passion rather than mutual convenience, of a life where she was chosen for herself rather than for her suitability to a role that needed filling. Her father's concern cut deeper than her mother's joy, his quiet question about her happiness hanging in the air between them like an accusation, and Eleanor found herself reassuring him with words that felt hollow even as she spoke them, explaining that happiness was not guaranteed to anyone and that she would find contentment in knowing her family was secure, that she would build a life of purpose and dignity, even if it lacked the romantic love she had once been foolish enough to hope for. She sent her acceptance to the Duke that very evening, writing the words in her careful hand and watching the ink dry with the strange sensation of watching her old self disappear. And the weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparations and legalities, and the quiet settling of debts that had hung over her family like a storm cloud, for longer than Eleanor cared to remember. The wedding itself was exactly as she had requested when the Duke had asked her preference, a simple ceremony in a small church with only her parents and the Duke's solicitor as witnesses, no grand affair to draw the attention of a society that would whisper and speculate, regardless of what she did. And Eleanor spoke her vows in a clear voice that did not tremble, binding herself to a man whose expression remained as unreadable as it had been the first moment she saw him. The whispers began before the ink was dry on the register, spreading through London's drawing rooms like wildfire, incredulous speculation about what could possibly have possessed the most eligible bachelor in England to choose a nobody with nothing to recommend her, and Eleanor heard echoes of those whispers in the glances of servants and the carefully worded congratulations of distant relations who could not quite conceal their astonishment. She steeled herself against the judgment, wrapping her dignity around her like armor, reminding herself that she had not asked for love and therefore could not be wounded by its absence, and when the carriage pulled away from London bearing her toward Ravensmoor and her new life as the Duchess of Ashworth, she looked out the window at the passing countryside and allowed herself to feel, just for a moment, the fragile flutter of something that might have been hope. Ravensmoor rose from the countryside like something out of a dream, its honey-colored stone glowing warm in the afternoon light as the carriage crested the final hill, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of what was now, impossibly, her home. She had expected grandeur, had steeled herself for the cold magnificence that wealth so often produced, but the estate that sprawled before her possessed a beauty that felt almost welcoming, its elegant lines softened by climbing roses and ancient oaks that spoke of generations of careful tending, of a place that had been loved rather than merely maintained. The Duke sat across from her in silence as he had for much of the journey, but she noticed his gaze turn toward the window as they approached, something shifting almost imperceptibly in his expression that might have been relief or might have been the closest thing to warmth she had yet seen him display. The household staff had assembled to greet them, a long line of faces that Eleanor found herself studying with anxious attention, searching for the judgment or resentment she half expected from servants who must surely wonder what their master had been thinking in choosing such an unremarkable bride. Instead, she found something that surprised her: respectful curtsies and bows, yes, but also glances exchanged between the maids that seemed almost pleased, and when Mrs. Barrett, the housekeeper, stepped forward to welcome her, the older woman's eyes held a warmth that seemed entirely genuine. The housekeeper showed her to her chambers with a stream of gentle chatter about the household and its workings, and Eleanor listened carefully, grateful for the information and oddly touched by the woman's obvious relief that Ravensmoor would finally have a proper mistress after so many years. Her rooms were beautiful beyond anything she had imagined, decorated in soft blues and creams that caught the light from tall windows overlooking a garden that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a distant lake. And when Mrs. Barrett mentioned that His Grace had instructed her to arrange everything according to the new Duchess's preferences, that nothing was fixed and everything could be changed to suit her tastes, Eleanor felt something loosen slightly in her chest that had been clenched tight since the moment she had spoken her wedding vows. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, just the two of them in a dining room that could have seated 40, and Eleanor struggled against silences that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, searching for topics of conversation that would not reveal how thoroughly out of her depth she felt. He asked about her interests, his tone formal but not unkind, and when she mentioned her love of books, something flickered in those grey eyes that she could not quite interpret. He rose from the table without explanation and led her through corridors she did not yet know, stopping finally before a set of carved oak doors that he pushed open to reveal a library so vast, so magnificent, so perfectly aligned with every bookish fantasy she had ever harbored, that Eleanor could only stand in the doorway with her hand pressed to her heart and her lips parted in wordless wonder. Thousands of volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines gleaming in the lamplight, and the Duke stood beside her in silence for a long moment before speaking the words that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. "It is yours now, all of it." The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had not anticipated, a quiet pattern of mornings spent reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Barrett and afternoons lost in the magnificent library that still made her breath catch each time she entered, and through it all she found herself noticing things about her husband that contradicted everything society had whispered about the cold and forbidding Duke of Ashworth. It began with small observations, details so minor that she might have dismissed them as coincidence had they not accumulated with such consistency. The way her morning tea arrived, prepared exactly as she preferred it, with honey rather than sugar, though she could not recall ever mentioning her preference to anyone but the maid who had attended her on that first overwhelming day. Then there were the books that appeared in her sitting room without explanation, volumes she had mentioned in passing during their increasingly lengthy dinner conversations, titles she had wondered about aloud and then forgotten, yet somehow he had remembered and procured them for her, as though her idle curiosities were matters worthy of attention. Fresh hothouse flowers began appearing in her chambers each morning, not the fashionable arrangements that society deemed appropriate, but the simple blooms she had loved since childhood, wildflowers and roses in soft colors that reminded her of her mother's modest garden. And when she asked Mrs. Barrett about them, the housekeeper smiled knowingly and said only that His Grace had given specific instructions. Their dinners together stretched longer as the days passed, the awkward silences of their first evening gradually filling with conversation that ranged from estate matters to philosophy to the books they were both reading, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to these hours with an anticipation that surprised her. One evening he spoke haltingly of his childhood, of a father whose expectations had crushed rather than cultivated, of a mother whose affection had been the only warmth in a house designed to produce a perfect heir rather than a happy son, and Eleanor listened with her heart aching for the lonely boy he must have been, understanding suddenly why he had built such formidable walls around himself. He asked about her own past, and she felt herself tense, not yet ready to speak of Reginald, not yet willing to reveal the depth of her humiliation to this man whose good opinion she was beginning to value more than she had expected, and she deflected with practiced ease toward safer subjects, while something in his grey eyes suggested he understood there were wounds she was not yet ready to show. It happened without warning. A comment he made about a particularly pompous character in the novel they had both been reading, his delivery so unexpected and so perfectly dry that laughter escaped her before she could contain it, genuine and bright and utterly unguarded, and when she looked at him, she saw something extraordinary. The corner of his stern mouth curved upward, his grey eyes warming with what could only be amusement, and for one brief moment the formidable Duke of Ashworth looked almost approachable, almost soft, almost like a man who might be capable of joy if only someone would teach him how to reach for it. The letter arrived on a grey February morning, its elegant script and heavy cream paper, announcing what Eleanor had been dreading since the first snowdrops pushed through the frozen ground. The season was approaching, and the Duke of Ashworth would be expected to present his new Duchess to society. She read the words detailing their required attendance at a series of balls and dinners, their obligation to open Ashworth House in London and take their place among the ton, and she felt the fragile peace she had cultivated at Ravensmoor begin to crack and splinter like ice beneath an unexpected weight. London meant society, and society meant whispers, and whispers meant facing all those people who had witnessed her humiliation, who had laughed behind their fans as Reginald Blackmore declared her unworthy of his attention, who would surely wonder what the Duke of Ashworth could possibly see in a woman so thoroughly rejected by a mere heir to an earldom. The days that followed were marked by a tension Eleanor could not quite conceal, a tightness in her shoulders and a distraction in her eyes that she thought she hid well, until one evening, when the Duke set down his book and regarded her across the library with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. He asked directly, as was his way, what troubled her, and something in the quiet steadiness of his gaze, in the weeks of small kindnesses that had accumulated between them like snowfall, gradually covering barren ground, made Eleanor finally speak the words she had guarded so carefully since the day they met. She told him everything: Reginald's courtship, his promises, the hope she had allowed herself to feel despite her practical nature, And then the devastating public rejection that had shattered not only her prospects, but her belief in her own worth. She described the laughter that had followed her from Lady Pembroke's ballroom, the pitying glances, the way former friends had suddenly found themselves too busy to call. And as she spoke, she watched the Duke's face transform from its usual stern composure into something far more frightening, a cold fury that burned in his eyes and tightened his jaw until she almost regretted her confession. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a held breath, and then he spoke in a voice so controlled, so deadly quiet, that Eleanor understood for the first time why powerful men treated the Duke of Ashworth with such careful deference. He was not merely wealthy and titled, he was dangerous when provoked, and she had just provoked him on her behalf in a way that left her uncertain whether to feel protected or alarmed. His words were simple, delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. No one would speak ill of her again. No one would dare look at her with anything less than the respect due to the Duchess of Ashworth, and if anyone attempted otherwise, they would discover precisely what it meant to earn his displeasure. Eleanor did not know whether to believe him, did not know whether any man could truly shield her from the cruelty of the ton, but as they departed for London 2 days later, she found herself watching him with new eyes, wondering what he might do when faced with the man who had broken her, and feeling for the first time in 2 years something that might have been the stirring of hope beneath her carefully cultivated resignation. The evening of Lady Worthington's ball arrived with all the inexorable certainty of a sentence long delayed, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chambers at Ashworth House, while her maid arranged the final touches of her toilette, watching her own reflection as though observing a stranger prepared for battle, rather than a duchess preparing for a dance. The gown was exquisite, a creation of sapphire silk that caught the candlelight and transformed it into something luminous. The bodice fitted perfectly to her form, while the skirt swept behind her in elegant waves that whispered against the floor with each small movement she made. At her throat lay the Ashworth diamonds, a stunning cascade of stones that had adorned duchesses for generations, their weight both literal and symbolic against her skin, and Eleanor found herself touching them repeatedly as though to confirm they were real, as though to remind herself that she had every right to wear them, despite what some might whisper behind their fans. The Duke appeared in her doorway precisely at the appointed hour, his tall figure immaculate in black evening clothes that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the severe handsomeness of his features, and when his grey eyes fell upon her, she saw something flicker in their depths, something that might have been admiration or approval, or perhaps something warmer still, though he expressed it only through a brief nod and the single word "beautiful" spoken in his characteristic, measured tone. The carriage ride passed in tense silence, Eleanor's gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, while she rehearsed in her mind all the dignified responses she might offer to the cutting remarks she anticipated, and beside her the Duke sat with his customary stillness, though once his hand reached across and covered hers for just a moment, a gesture of reassurance that steadied her racing heart more than any words could have done. When they arrived at Lady Worthington's grand townhouse, the entrance hall blazing with light and buzzing with the conversation of London's most distinguished families, Eleanor felt every eye turn toward them as the majordomo announced their names in ringing tones, and the sudden hush that fell over the nearby guests confirmed what she had dreaded. Society had been waiting for this moment, hungry for a glimpse of the woman who had somehow captured the uncatchable Duke of Ashworth. She lifted her chin and placed her hand upon her husband's offered arm, and together they descended into the ballroom, while whispers followed them like shadows. But the Duke's presence beside her was steady and unyielding as stone, his hand pressing hers firmly against his arm in silent reassurance. He introduced her to one influential personage after another, to countesses and earls and powerful political figures who treated her with careful deference because they understood that to slight the Duchess of Ashworth was to invite the displeasure of a man whose influence they could not afford to lose, and gradually Eleanor felt some of her tension ease as she realized that whatever society might think of her personally, none would dare voice their contempt openly. She had almost begun to enjoy herself, had almost allowed herself to believe that this evening might pass without incident, when her gaze drifted across the crowded ballroom and landed upon a face she had hoped never to see again, and her heart seized painfully in her chest as she watched Lord Reginald Blackmore turn toward her, with recognition dawning in his cold blue eyes, his wife Arabella standing beside him with a pinched and unhappy expression that suggested her £40,000 had purchased something far less satisfying than she had anticipated. He moved through the crowd toward them with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, his smile fixed in that charming expression Eleanor remembered so well from the days when she had foolishly believed it meant something, and as he approached, she felt the familiar sensation of her throat closing and her heart racing, and all the carefully constructed composure she had cultivated over 2 years, threatening to crumble into dust at her feet. His greeting was everything she had anticipated and feared, his voice carrying just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear as he offered an elegant bow and spoke with false warmth that did nothing to disguise the malice beneath. How surprising to see her elevated so. "Miss, forgive me, Your Grace." He corrected himself with exaggerated deference. What an unexpected turn of fortune for one who once seemed destined for such a different path. Arabella stood slightly behind him, her face a study in barely concealed misery, her expensive gown and elaborate jewels doing nothing to disguise the unhappiness that had carved lines around her mouth and dulled the brightness of her eyes. And Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that £40,000 had purchased this woman nothing but a cold husband and a lonely marriage, and the bitter knowledge that she had traded her fortune for a title held by a man incapable of genuine affection. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, to offer some dignified reply that would demonstrate how little his words affected her, but found herself frozen as though the intervening years had melted away, and she was once again that devastated girl in Lady Pembroke's ballroom, hearing herself declared unworthy before the assembled ton, feeling her dreams shatter around her like fine china thrown against marble floors. She did not need to find her voice, however, because in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the Duke stepped forward, and the temperature surrounding their small group seemed to drop by several degrees as he fixed Reginald with a gaze that could have frozen the Thames in July, and spoke in a voice so cold, so controlled, so lethally precise that Eleanor saw the colour drain from Reginald's face like water from a shattered vessel. "My wife," the Duke said with terrible emphasis, "requires no elevation, Lord Blackmore, for she has always possessed what your sort cannot purchase, regardless of how desperately you might try. Genuine worth, true grace, a quality of character that money can neither buy nor imitate." The ballroom had gone utterly silent around them, nearby conversations dying away as guests turned to witness the unprecedented spectacle of the Duke of Ashworth, defending his Duchess with a ferocity none had ever seen him display, and Eleanor watched as Reginald's confident smile faltered and crumbled and finally disappeared entirely, replaced by the dawning realization that he had grievously miscalculated in approaching a woman who was no longer unprotected, who now had a champion willing to destroy any man foolish enough to offer insult. "I suggest," the Duke continued with the same deadly calm, "that you remember precisely to whom you speak, and conduct yourself accordingly for whatever remains of your time in society, assuming you have the wisdom to remove yourself from my presence before I decide to make my displeasure more widely known." Reginald retreated, nearly stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape, and as Eleanor stood in the ringing silence that followed, she felt something fundamental shift within her chest, a cracking open of walls she had built so carefully, a dawning recognition that this stern, reserved man had just defended her honour before all of London with a passion that revealed depths she was only beginning to understand. And for the first time since that terrible night 2 years ago, she felt not shame but something far more dangerous, the wild, terrifying, irresistible stirring of hope. The carriage ride home passed in a silence unlike any they had shared before, charged with unspoken feeling and the lingering electricity of what had transpired in that glittering ballroom, and Eleanor sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap while she searched for words adequate to express the tumult of emotions threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She had spent 2 years building walls around her wounded heart, 2 years convincing herself that she was unworthy of defense or devotion, 2 years accepting the judgment of a man who had never possessed the capacity to recognize true worth. And in the space of a single moment, her husband had dismantled every one of those carefully constructed beliefs with nothing more than the cold fury of his voice and the unwavering conviction of his words. When at last she found her voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper, a simple expression of gratitude that felt wholly inadequate to convey the depth of what his defense had meant to her and she watched his profile in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows as she spoke, saw the slight tightening of his jaw that she had come to recognize as his response to strong emotion. He dismissed her thanks with characteristic brevity, insisting that he had spoken only simple truth, that any man with eyes to see and wit to understand would recognize what Reginald Blackmore had been too foolish and too mercenary to value, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the matter-of-fact certainty in his tone, as though her worth was so self-evident that defending it required no particular courage or consideration. Then he turned to look at her directly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and he spoke words that would echo in her memory for years to come. "You are worth 10 of such men, Eleanor, worth 100, and I would have said far more had propriety permitted." She felt the hot prick of tears behind her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt the careful armor she had constructed around her heart begin to crack and crumble beneath the weight of his quiet conviction, and she had to look away toward the darkened streets passing beyond the window, lest he see how thoroughly his words had undone her. When they arrived at Ashworth House and parted for their separate chambers as was their custom, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep despite the lateness of the hour, lying instead in her elegant bed while she replayed every moment of the evening in exhaustive detail. The cold malice in Reginald's eyes, the misery evident in Arabella's pinched features, the absolute fearlessness with which her husband had stepped forward to shield her from harm. She thought of his hand, steady at her back throughout the evening, his careful attention to her comfort, the way he had introduced her to London's most powerful figures with unmistakable pride in his voice, and she recognized with dawning wonder that something fundamental had shifted within her heart, something she had believed dead and buried, rising slowly back to trembling life. She was beginning to feel something dangerous, something she had sworn never to permit herself again after Reginald's betrayal had taught her the terrible cost of such vulnerability. She was beginning to feel hope. The weeks that followed Lady Worthington's ball unfolded with a sweetness Eleanor had never dared imagine, each day bringing new discoveries about the man she had married, and the unexpected depth of feeling growing between them like some tender plant that had found at last the conditions necessary for flourishing. They attended more balls and soirees as the season demanded, and at each one Eleanor noticed how her husband positioned himself as her constant guardian, his hand finding the small of her back as though it belonged there, his grey eyes scanning every room for potential threats to her comfort or dignity, his cold demeanor thawing perceptibly whenever he looked upon her face. Yet it was not the public occasions that nurtured the bond forming between them, but rather the quiet hours they began to spend together at Ashworth House, evenings that had once passed in awkward silence, now filled with conversation and comfortable companionship, and something that felt increasingly like intimacy of the truest kind. They developed rituals without ever consciously deciding to do so. Reading together in the library after dinner, Eleanor curled in the chair nearest the fire, while Marcus occupied the one beside her, their books, sometimes forgotten, as discussion of the day's events or memories of childhood or dreams for the future, carried them deep into the night. On fine mornings they walked together in the small garden behind the townhouse, and it was during one such walk that Marcus confessed something Eleanor suspected he had never spoken aloud to another living soul, that he had spent the whole of his adult life believing himself incapable of inspiring genuine affection, that his father's coldness and his own reserved nature had convinced him he would never know true companionship, that he had proposed their practical arrangement, fully expecting to live out his days in comfortable but lonely partnership with a woman who tolerated his presence without truly seeing him. Eleanor found herself sharing in return, telling him of the fears that had haunted her since Reginald's betrayal, that she would never be enough for anyone, that there was some fundamental deficiency within her that rendered her unworthy of real love, that she had accepted his proposal, believing she deserved nothing better than a business arrangement dressed in wedding clothes. These confessions created a new closeness between them, a sense of being truly known and accepted that neither had experienced before, and Eleanor became increasingly aware of her husband in ways that had nothing to do with conversation or companionship. The breadth of his shoulders when he stood near her, the way his voice dropped to a lower register when they spoke privately, the heat of his body when they sat close together in the library. One evening, as they read in their accustomed places, Marcus reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand in his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as breathing, and neither of them pulled away or acknowledged the gesture with words, simply allowing the connection to exist as though it had always been inevitable. The household staff noticed the change in their master, the softening of his stern features when the Duchess entered a room, the sound of his laughter echoing through halls that had known only silence for so many years, and Mrs. Barrett was overheard telling the cook that she had never seen His Grace so content in all her decades of service. Eleanor, lying awake at night in her chamber, could no longer pretend that what she felt was merely gratitude or comfortable affection. She wanted her husband with a ferocity that frightened her, wanted not just his protection and his conversation, but his heart, his passion, his everything, and she knew with terrifying certainty that a practical arrangement would never again be sufficient for a soul that had finally remembered how to hope. Eleanor's birthday arrived on a grey morning in late May, and she had spoken of it to no one, had made no mention of the date's significance to her husband or the household staff, for she had long ago learned to expect nothing and thereby spare herself the sting of disappointment that inevitably followed hope. She had spent so many birthdays in quiet solitude since Reginald's betrayal, marking the passage of another year with nothing more than private reflection on all she had lost and all she had resigned herself to never having, that it seemed almost natural to let this one pass unmarked as well, another day distinguished from its fellows only in her own silent awareness. She came down to breakfast expecting nothing out of the ordinary and found Marcus already seated at the table, which was itself unusual as he typically rose earlier and attended to correspondence in his study before she appeared, and she noticed immediately that there was something different in his demeanor, a barely perceptible tension in the set of his shoulders and a quality of watchfulness in his grey eyes that made her pulse quicken without understanding why. He waited until she had been served her tea and had taken her first sip before he spoke, and even then his words were halting, almost uncertain, so unlike his usual decisive manner that Eleanor felt her confusion deepen into something approaching alarm. He asked if she had truly believed he would not discover the date of her birth, and when she could find no adequate response, he rose from his chair and retrieved a parcel wrapped in deep blue paper from the sideboard, presenting it to her with an expression she could not quite interpret, something between hope and apprehension that seemed foreign on features usually so carefully controlled. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the gift, and when she saw what lay within the paper, she felt the world grow suddenly still around her. A first edition of her favorite novel, the one she had mentioned only once in passing during one of their evening conversations, the one she had loved since girlhood and never been able to afford in anything but the cheapest reprinted form. She opened the cover with reverent fingers and found an inscription written in her husband's bold hand, the words blurring before her eyes as their meaning penetrated the defenses she had built around her heart. For Eleanor, who taught me that some treasures cannot be measured in gold. The tears came then, sudden and overwhelming, spilling down her cheeks before she could think to prevent them, and she saw alarm flash across Marcus's face as he moved toward her, clearly distressed by her weeping and uncertain whether his gift had somehow caused offense rather than pleasure. She had to explain through her tears that no one had ever seen her so clearly, that no one had ever listened carefully enough to remember the small details of her preferences and desires, that no one had ever made her feel so thoroughly known and valued for nothing more than herself, and as she spoke she watched understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that looked almost like wonder. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away should she wish it, and when she remained still his fingers brushed gently across her cheek, catching a tear and wiping it away with a tenderness that stole her breath entirely. Neither of them spoke in the moments that followed, but words had become unnecessary, for everything that mattered hung visible in the air between them, acknowledged at last even if not yet named, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that nothing between them would ever be the same. The days that followed Eleanor's birthday passed in a strange, suspended state, the air between her and Marcus charged with everything that remained unspoken, every glance weighted with meaning neither yet dared articulate, every accidental brush of fingers sending currents of awareness through Eleanor's entire being until she thought she might shatter from the force of containing so much feeling within the fragile vessel of her heart. They continued their established rituals, the morning walks, the evening readings, the lingering dinners, but everything felt different now, transformed by the knowledge that hovered between them like morning mist waiting to be burned away by the sun, and Eleanor found herself watching her husband with new eyes, cataloguing every small gesture, every softening of his stern features, every moment when his grey gaze rested upon her with something that looked increasingly like hunger. She knew she should speak, should find the courage to give voice to the tumult within her breast, but the old fears held her tongue captive. The memory of Reginald's rejection, whispering that she was foolish to believe a man like Marcus could truly want her for anything beyond the practical arrangement they had agreed upon, and so she remained silent, even as her heart threatened to overflow with words she could not quite bring herself to say. It was Marcus who finally shattered the tension. On an evening when rain streaked the library windows and the fire crackled low in the grate, and Eleanor sat with a book she had not truly read for the past hour, her attention fixed entirely upon the man in the chair beside hers, who had set down his own volume, and was watching her with an expression she had never seen upon his face before, something raw and vulnerable that made her breath catch in her throat. He spoke her name, just her name, and something in his voice made her set aside her book and turn to face him fully, and she saw his hands clench upon the arms of his chair, as though he were steeling himself for battle. And when he spoke again, his words came haltingly, each one seeming to cost him tremendous effort, as though he were a man unused to the language of tender feeling, attempting to navigate a foreign tongue. He told her that he had not expected this, that when he proposed their arrangement, he had believed himself content with practicality and companionship, and the quiet satisfaction of having chosen well, but that somewhere in the weeks and months since their wedding everything had changed, shifted, transformed into something he barely recognized, and he found now that he could not imagine his life without her in it, could not contemplate returning to the cold existence he had known before she came to fill his home, and his days with warmth and laughter, and the simple, profound pleasure of her presence. His voice dropped lower still as he spoke the words Eleanor had never truly believed she would hear directed at herself. "You have become everything to me, Eleanor. I love you." The tears came then, impossible to prevent, and through them Eleanor spoke her own truth at last, confessing her fears, her disbelief that she could be truly loved, and finally, the admission that had burned within her for weeks: "I love you. I think I have loved you for longer than I knew." Marcus rose from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, drawing her to her feet, and when his lips met hers the kiss was tender and passionate and perfect, a seal upon their declarations, a promise of everything yet to come. That night, when the fire had burned low and the rain had gentled to a soft whisper against the windows, Marcus led Eleanor not to the door of her own chambers but to his, and she followed willingly, her heart beating so fiercely she was certain he must feel it through the fingers intertwined with hers. And when the door closed behind them and they stood alone in the flickering candlelight, she felt no fear, no hesitation, only a profound and overwhelming sense of rightness, of finally arriving at a destination she had not known she was seeking. He was tender in ways she had never imagined, his hands gentle as they traced the lines of her face, her shoulders, the curve of her waist, as though she were something precious and fragile that he feared to damage, and when she trembled it was not from cold or apprehension, but from the sheer intensity of being touched with such reverence, such unmistakable devotion, by a man who had seemed to all the world incapable of such feeling. He whispered words against her skin as he held her, words of love and wonder and gratitude, telling her that she was beautiful, that she was wanted, that she was everything he had never dared hope to find, and each word settled into her heart like seeds, taking root in fertile soil, filling spaces that had been barren and empty for so long she had forgotten they existed. When they came together at last, it was with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. Tears of joy this time rather than sorrow, and she clung to him as though he were the only solid thing in a world suddenly remade, gasping his name like a prayer, feeling herself known and cherished and desired in ways that transformed everything she had believed about herself and her worth. Afterward they lay tangled together beneath the heavy coverlet, her head upon his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart gradually slowing, and they spoke in hushed voices of small things and great things, of the future stretching before them bright with possibility, of the children they might have, of the life they would build together at Ravensmoor and in London and wherever else their journey might take them, and sometimes they simply lay in companionable silence, needing no words to communicate the profound contentment that filled them both. He told her that she had transformed him, that before her arrival he had been a man merely existing, going through the motions of life without truly living, and that she had given him reason to hope, reason to believe that happiness was not merely a fairy story told to children, but something real and attainable. And Eleanor pressed her lips to the place above his heart and told him that he had done the same for her, had shown her that she was worthy of love, had healed wounds she had believed would ache forever. When sleep finally claimed them, they lay intertwined, limbs tangled together as though even in unconsciousness they could not bear to be parted. And Eleanor's last thought before surrendering to dreams was one of pure and perfect wonder that this was her life now, that this man was hers and she was his, that the cold, practical arrangement they had agreed upon had blossomed into something so beautiful and complete that it seemed almost impossible, and yet here she lay in his arms, loved beyond measure, whole at last. The weeks that followed their union transformed not only the private hours Eleanor and Marcus shared, but their public existence as well, and society, ever watchful for scandal or sensation, found itself witness to something far more remarkable than either: the complete and undeniable metamorphosis of the Duke of Ashworth from the coldest man in England to a husband so obviously besotted with his wife that it became the subject of whispered conversation in every drawing-room in London. He danced now, this man who had famously refused to take the floor at any ball for the past decade, but he danced only with Eleanor, leading her through waltzes with a possessive tenderness that made the watching matrons fan themselves and the young debutantes sigh with romantic longing. And when the music ended, he did not release her to the company of others, but kept her at his side, his hand resting at the small of her back with an intimacy that spoke of absolute belonging. The ladies who had once whispered cruel assessments of Eleanor's modest dowry and unremarkable connections now sought her favor with desperate enthusiasm, sending cards and invitations and flattering notes that Eleanor received with gracious dignity and quiet private amusement, understanding perfectly well that their sudden warmth had everything to do with her husband's power and nothing to do with any genuine regard, yet finding she no longer cared what motivated their attentions because she had the only regard that truly mattered. At Lady Pemberton's grand ball, the event of the season, Eleanor caught sight of Lord Reginald Blackmore and his wife Arabella standing at the edge of the room, and where once the sight would have sent ice through her veins, she now observed them with something approaching pity. Arabella's face was pinched and unhappy, her magnificent gown unable to disguise the misery in her eyes, while Reginald himself looked diminished somehow, his fortune reportedly dwindling through poor investments, his consequence fading as society's attention turned to newer, brighter stars. It was at this same ball that Marcus rose during supper, crystal glass in hand, and the room fell silent with anticipation as the Duke of Ashworth commanded attention as effortlessly as he commanded everything else. And when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the grand dining room. To the Duchess of Ashworth, the finest woman in England, whose grace and goodness honor me daily beyond any merit of my own. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze in the room upon her as she lifted her own glass in acknowledgement, but she did not blush or shrink as she might have done mere months ago. Instead, she met her husband's eyes across the gleaming silver and crystal and smiled with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew herself, loved, and in that moment she understood that the whispers surrounding her had changed entirely, transformed from speculation about her unworthiness to marvel at her good fortune, though Eleanor knew the truth that escaped society's understanding. It was not fortune at all, but the miraculous gift of having been truly seen by the one person whose vision mattered. And in that seeing, everything had changed. 5 years had passed since that first season as the Duchess of Ashworth, 5 years that had flowed like honey, golden and sweet, and rich with all the blessings Eleanor had once believed would never be hers. And as she stood at the window of Ravensmoor's morning room, watching her children play upon the sunlit lawn, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed from those dark days when she had believed herself unworthy of love, undeserving of happiness, destined for nothing more than practical endurance of whatever fate provided. There were 3 of them now, 3 precious souls who had made their family complete. Charlotte, the eldest at 4, who had inherited her mother's warm brown eyes and gentle disposition. Elizabeth, just turned 2, a merry sprite with her father's dark hair and an imp's smile that could coax laughter from even the most reserved of servants. And baby William, barely 6 months old, who gazed at the world through eyes of piercing grey that were so exactly like Marcus's that Eleanor's heart clenched with love each time she looked upon him. The years had only deepened the bond between Eleanor and her husband, their early tender affection maturing into something richer and more profound, a partnership built upon mutual respect and unwavering devotion that seemed to strengthen with each passing season. Each shared joy and weathered difficulty, binding them more closely together, until Eleanor could scarcely remember what her life had felt like before Marcus had become the center of it. He remained reserved with society, this husband of hers, still the formidable duke who inspired awe and perhaps a touch of fear in those who did not know him well, but within the walls of their home he was transformed entirely, a devoted father who could be found crawling upon the nursery floor with his daughters or walking the corridors at midnight with a fretful infant cradled against his broad chest, and the sight of such tenderness from a man the world deemed cold never failed to fill Eleanor with profound gratitude for the gift of being allowed to see his true self. Her parents had visited just last week, her father's health much improved thanks to the excellent physicians Marcus had quietly arranged, her mother radiant with contentment as she spoiled her grandchildren with sweets and stories, and Eleanor had watched them together with a heart so full she thought it might overflow, remembering how close they had come to losing everything, how desperate their situation had seemed before a single letter had changed the course of all their lives. News of Reginald had reached them occasionally over the years, each report more dismal than the last. The divorce from Arabella had been scandalous, her fortune depleted and her patience exhausted, and Reginald himself had retreated to a modest property in the country, his consequence entirely diminished, his name spoken now only as a cautionary tale about the folly of valuing wealth above character. Eleanor found she could summon no satisfaction at his downfall, only a quiet gratitude that she had been spared such a fate, that his cruel rejection had ultimately delivered her to something infinitely better than anything he could have offered. That evening, after the children had been kissed and tucked into their beds, Marcus found her in the library where she sat curled in her favorite chair with a book she was not truly reading, and he crossed to her without speaking, drawing her up into his arms and holding her close as the fire crackled softly in the grate. "I thank God every day that you said yes," he murmured against her hair, and Eleanor pressed closer to him, breathing in the familiar beloved scent of him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "And I thank God every day that you saw me," she whispered back, when no one else did. And so we come to the end of Eleanor's story, though in truth it is not an ending at all, but merely a pause in a tale that continues still in the halls of Ravensmoor, in the laughter of children and the quiet moments shared between two souls who found in each other what neither had dared to hope existed, a love that was not born of passion's fleeting flame, but forged in the steadier fire of respect and kindness and the daily choice to see and cherish another person completely. Eleanor's journey had begun in humiliation, in the cruel words of a man who measured worth only in pounds and pence and found her wanting, and she had believed those words for so long, had allowed them to burrow into her heart and convince her that she was somehow less than, somehow undeserving of the happiness that seemed to come so easily to others, and yet the very wound that had nearly destroyed her had ultimately led her to something far greater than anything Lord Reginald Blackmore could ever have offered, for it had led her to Marcus, to a man whose actions spoke truths that pretty words could never equal. This is the lesson Eleanor carried with her through all the years that followed, that love built upon the foundation of mutual respect and genuine trust will always outshine the brightest infatuation, that the measure of a person's character lies not in the declarations they make, but in the small, consistent kindnesses they offer when no one is watching, that the right person will see your worth even when the world has convinced you that you have none. If you have journeyed with Eleanor through these pages, through her darkest moments and her greatest joys, then perhaps you carry some piece of her story within you now, and it is my deepest hope that her tale has offered you something of value, whether that be a few hours of pleasant escape or something more lasting, a quiet reminder that the opinions of those who cannot see your true self are worth nothing at all, and that somewhere in this vast world there may be someone capable of loving you exactly as you are, not despite your perceived flaws but inclusive of everything that makes you uniquely yourself. The final image I leave you with is this: a summer evening at Ravensmoor, the gardens ablaze with roses in full bloom, and Eleanor and Marcus walking hand in hand along the gravel path while their children's laughter echoes from somewhere beyond the hedge, where they play at some elaborate game of their own devising, and Eleanor pauses to look up at her husband, at this man who saw her when no one else did, who chose her over every glittering heiress in London, not because she possessed fortune or exceptional beauty, but because he recognized in her the qualities that truly mattered, and she smiles, with the complete contentment of a woman who knows herself loved, and he smiles back with the warmth he reserves only for her. And the cruel words spoken all those years ago at Lady Pembroke's ball seem to belong to another lifetime entirely, meaningless echoes that cannot touch her here in the life she has built with a man who understood from the very beginning what Reginald Blackmore never could, that Eleanor Ashworth was always worthy of love, that she had always been enough, and that she simply needed someone wise enough to see it.